Hi, colleagues. Let's just wait a few minutes, then we can start.
I see more and more people coming in. I think we're waiting 1-2 minutes more to respect everyone's time, and then we can slowly start.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's start, and thanks a lot for your patience. I'm Maria Claudia Bodino, and together with my team, with Athena and with Christophe, we are really delighted to welcome you today in this new iTalk series from the Digital Innovation Lab of the European Commission. The iLab, the Innovation Lab, is a new initiative. It's about exploring and also try to experiment and promote together new innovative way to create collective knowledge and improve how the public sector is currently working and also interacting with citizens, with academia, and with private sector. We are quite young, and this is our first public event where we open our door to people outside the institutions. So we have today participants from academia, from private sector, from GovTech, and also from civil society. We are looking for new synergies. Please, if you're interested, let us know. We are looking also for new partnership and cooperation with the existing innovation lab, also from other institutions, not just from the private, not just from the public sector, but also from the private sector. Please feel free to get in touch, and also keep in mind that this year, the European Commission has declared the European Years of Skills. This is the main reason why we decide to create this new series, where we try to understand how the different stakeholders are trying to address the lack of data skills in the public sector, looking at very concrete initiative, projects, and also challenges that we are facing. And we are trying to look at this issue from different perspectives, from the academia side, but also from the GovTech and from the institutional side. Today, we are really honored to sit down with David Eaves, that is an associate professor in digital government from the UCL, and also is the co-founder of this great initiative that is called Teaching Public Service in the Digital Age. He's going to tell us more on this initiative, but it's a really tangible example in order to design a new curriculum to teach digital competencies and skill for future public leaders. So we are very honored to have you on board today, David. Then the next Tuesday, sorry, on the 3rd of July, we are going to meet Barbara Ubaldi from the OECD. So we are going back to the, let's say, to the public sector side. She's the head of the digital government and data unit, and she will present and share with us how the OECD and some countries are trying to develop data literacy in the public sector in order to contribute to a more, let's say, mature digital government. Thanks a lot again, David, for your time and for your contribution. And thanks, Athena and Christophe, for your support in the organization of these iTalks. Athena, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Claudia, for this introduction. So this is our 4th iTalk, and until now, we've had the chance to have a very curious participants. Since last talk, actually, we almost have 400 participants joining us from more than 18 countries. And this week, we had the chance to see Stefan Verholst, who gave us a great overview on the role of data stewards in data literacy. And today, to conclude this week, we have David Eaves. So if you're not familiar with David, he was named one of 100 most influential academics in government by Apolitical. As Maria Claudia mentioned, he's a professor associate in digital government at UCL, more specifically at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, and of course, the co-founder of the initiative Teaching Public Servant in Digital Age, which he will tell us more about today. So David, thank you for being here today. I invite you to share your screen. And if you have any questions for David, please use the Slido that we'll put in the chat or even the chat, and we will answer all these questions by the end of the session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. Maybe the first thing I would just recommend is if you could pin me so on the large screen. I'm going to have my slides over my shoulder, and that way they'll be more visible to everybody. Really, really excited to be here. So as mentioned, my name is David Eaves. I'm an associate professor, but I've also done a number of other things that I think have led me into the data world. So maybe 2 things in particular. One is I was an advisor to one of the governments that created maybe the 2nd open data portal in the world, and then advised a number of governments on their open data strategies. So really kind of came into the data world around thinking about kind of transparency and reuse, and then kind of what are the opportunities in the open data space. And then also started a company. And so we had a civic tech company that we grew to about 400 clients, mostly across North America, mostly at the municipal level, but had real data exchange issues with them where we were absorbing data from them and then repackaging that data and sharing it with citizens in kind of more accessible formats. And that led to me a very interesting understanding of how governments think about data and how they organize data. So here's what I want to do today is I want to first talk to you about the project that I mentioned before, which is the kind of project that we're using to try to upskill a number of public servants around the world. And then I want to just dive into some interesting topics around data that come out of my curriculum that I'm hoping might just generate some thoughts and some ideas for all of you that might just generally be interesting. So maybe the first thing I just want to talk a little bit about is when we think about public administration, I think we're often still teaching public administration as though it's 1980 or 1990. We really haven't started to think about digital era public administration. I've always open these talks by saying, I hate the term digital government, because when I say the words digital government, there's a whole lot of people who think I'm talking about the future. And the reality is we're talking about the present. The use and management of large quantities of data is a current today problem. The ability to deliver services to citizens over the internet is a current today problem. There's almost nothing a government does now that is not intermediated in some way by digital technologies. And so we need to be kind of starting to rethink how we teach public administration for a digital era. And that's what really drove this project that the team here mentioned when they were introducing me. So I was motivated in part by the fact that a huge percentage of projects that are technology oriented in governments fail, outright, just 19% outright fail. We take the money, we light it on fire, we have nothing to show for it. This is if we built highways the same way we built technology projects, there'd be an uproar. Cars would be crashing, roads wouldn't be built. People would lose confidence in the government. And even the other kind of 64% have significant challenges. That means they go over budget, they take much longer, and or they fail to deliver the public value that's expected. So we have this huge challenge actually operating in a digital era. And that kind of caused some of us in the kind of public administration field to kind of think about like, what should we be doing differently? And the truth is that actually us educators are part of the problem. I think most MPA, MPP type programs, like public affair type schools, have a pretty mixed response in how they teach about digital, given that we live in the digital age. Very, very few, these are American numbers, but very, very few programs have any requirement around technology as part of the degree. And what's more interesting is the regulatory body in the United States, at least, removed a technology requirement for accreditation. And the reason they did was they were like, wow, technology is so pervasive. It's so everywhere. We don't know how to define it and make it a requirement. So in some ways, it's so important now, we don't know what to do with it. But so we removed it. That's what led a group of us to kind of get together to think about what would it look like to reimagine public administration curriculum for digital era type problems. And so I think if you leave with nothing else today, I would love for you to have at least this URL at your disposal so that you go and check that out, because I think there you'll see kind of materials that can help civil service colleges, universities, in-house kind of corporate training, all open source, all available for you to use, but materials for how to teach this, materials for teaching these type of concepts that I'm going to talk a little bit about, and many, many, many others. So that this is like, if I at least do this, I feel like I've achieved my task. I just want to pause for a second. I do notice that when I'm looking at the Cisco meeting, I'm just in a small box. I'm hoping everybody else is seeing me in a big box. Otherwise, my slides are going to be very, very hard to see. So I don't know if the DigitB team is able to ensure that I'm definitely in the big box, but because right now I see DigitB WebEx conference host as the big box. So just want to make sure that's the case.
We can see your slide in the back, so it's perfect. Don't worry.
Okay, perfect. Just want to make sure. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So in this project here, just as kind of a quick background, one thing we did here is it's very university driven. So we're trying to get faculty to rethink so they teach their students differently. So we built a core community of people. We're trying to ground it in research, but we do bring in practitioners to help inform and make sure that things we're teaching are connected to practice. And so the very first thing we did was conduct, like over a year to 2 years, a kind of focus groups on what were the core competencies that need to be, that you need to have as like kind of like the basis for your course. And that looked like this. We had people from all around the world, like, Brazil and UK, Chicago, Germany, helping us kind of chart that and having these big debates about what really is core. And that led to kind of 8 competencies that I'm not going to go into all these detail on. You can go find them on the website, but like, what are the kind of core competencies that we think public servants need to have today? And then that's turned into a set of master classes that we run 2 to 4 times a year, where we teach faculty in universities and civil service colleges how to teach this material, how to integrate it into the courses they already teach. And like, just absolutely thrilled to say that we've already taught that material to faculty in over 50 universities. I think actually more in like north of 75 universities now. And in addition, the materials have been translated into Spanish, into Portuguese, and into French. So we are starting to have this kind of multilingual approach to dealing with this. So that's kind of a little bit of a background on that project. I'd love to take questions, answer questions on that, but I just want people to know that resource exists. Okay, because we're here to actually talk about data, I want to just talk about what I think are some of the interesting challenges right now in the data space and things we need to be thinking about. And I'm hoping that some of them are things that maybe people haven't talked about so far in this series and maybe a little bit different. So the first is, I think we're in this really interesting period now where data, you can start to think of data as actually kind of an emerging part of infrastructure for running any society, for running a company, for running a government, for running society at all. And how do we start to think about that? And how do we kind of organize data to allow it to be accessed and used in a kind of an infrastructure type approach? And so often I kind of walk my students through kind of what I think is a current existing model for particularly how governments are organized, which is this kind of interesting way where we kind of like, governments are kind of organized in these like vertical silos where you have like a tax department or a foreign service office or a kind of like maybe your kind of like employment agency, and each one of them like might have services, and those services actually have all sorts of kind of like duplicating elements to them. So like anytime you want to pay your taxes, you've got to authenticate, you got to sign in, you probably have to enter your address. You may have to provide some unique identifier, and then you have to fill out a form about like, you know, what's the information. And then all that data gets stored in the tax authority. And then if you want to go passport, you got to do the exact same thing. You have a different username and password, search for like enter an address. Maybe they have their own address database, enter in some, you know, unique identifier that they've sent you, fill out another form, and that gets stored in their database. And so you have all of this silos, and this is actually running, it's like this is how governments are historically organized, because they're really organized around how to move paper. So you kind of want things in silos so paper is easy to move around. But one of the huge benefits of technology is its capacity to scale and the kind of reduced costs of scaling almost infinitely. Your fixed costs are high, but once you're established, you actually scale and share more and more widely. And so government kind of imposes these vertical boundaries that prevent scaling. So only in a very few governments do you start to see models where they start thinking about kind of what are some shared services, like so single sign-on. So like the Dutch have a nice single sign-on system. But most countries don't. Most countries, like every service you encounter, you've got to like, you know, create a username and password for them. Do they have a canonical address registry where, you know, it's, you know, you can enter an address and it validates it, and that's being used by every single service? You know, and then are they storing some of this information in common places? And this is kind of what's made the Estonians so successful, is they've really tackled this model quite well, where there's some centrally shared data, and that's led to some shared services. There's some custom data that's still shared and some custom services as well, but it's made it much more efficient for them to distribute those services. And so if you kind of think about what the model of government looks like, you can imagine like what you really want is like ways of creating citizen-facing services that are much more dynamic and agile, that you can adjust based on policy or citizens' needs, but then some common infrastructure shared services like authentication and payments and things like that. But then the real key is like, what is the common sets of data that you'd have at the bottom of that government that are really single sources of truth that would allow you to do things like what the Estonians do, is like tell us what. So you can pre-populate every form, because you can go and like actually intelligently and in a privacy and security mannered way effectively share data across the enterprise. And that, again, as I mentioned, like when some people have seen this chart before, this is like the Estonian X road. This is like kind of the visualization of it. That is kind of what the X road does. There's your geospatial data, there's your EID, and then here is like the population data. All of this stuff is getting stored in a single place, and then it goes through the X road to actually get shared with the various services, so that the information is automatically populated in, the citizen's not redoing that over and over again. So this for me is a very interesting model. And the question is how do we push, like how do we make that happen more? And part of that goes to like, how do you think about the data? And it's not a technology problem, it's more of a social construction problem about how we organize both the data and then the users of said data. I love, like Simon Wardley is another colleague, has this kind of way of talking about how different types of technology or different types of forms evolve. So in the data world, you can kind of see like, you know, data moves from being unmodeled, like, so we're like observing phenomena and things like that, like, you know, or maybe we're counting cars, like they're driving down the street and we're just like using like little hashes to count them. So then like divergent models of capturing that data, different cities start capturing that data in different ways, and you have like these different schemas and different ways of doing it. And then over time, people kind of say, oh, like maybe we should like use what they did, and new people come on, they're like, I'm gonna reinvent the wheel, I'm gonna copy what they did. So you start to have convergence, and then if something's really useful, it actually becomes standardized and structured over time. So you can kind of think of this evolution that data takes. And so what the Estonians are kind of really doing is they're moving all of the ministries that have divergent or sometimes convergent forms of data and really creating a single structured way of organizing data inside that government. And so you can kind of see like, this is a technology push, but it's actually almost more a policy and social push to get organizations to agree around what are the structured ways that we'd want to keep core data that you'd need to run a society or to run a government. And then once you can, what the great thing is, the moment you structure data, the moment you make it organized and it kind of effectively interoperable, all these new use cases for that data become really apparent, because you're like, oh, now we have a standard way of doing it. Now I can use that data to create all sorts of new services on top of it. So when we standardize, say, postal code data, now that makes like geolocating people and problems much, much, much easier in your country, because now you have a standard way of referencing that. And so now, like, all these kind of new ways of measuring and creating new data, which like creates a whole new mess of data and that you have to think about. But it also now allows you to start thinking about what are the processes for that you could begin to standardize over time, because now you have standardized data that those processes are based on. And then that starts to help you think about how you could standardize the software that would run those processes and collect that data. So this is kind of one way you start to think about the way that you could begin to organize data inside a kind of a government enterprise, but really any enterprise if you want, any large enterprise. And this is one of the places where emerging markets kind of have an advantage, because in mature markets, we've got all these different government silos create this data in isolation. And now they're kind of like struggling to figure out how do we converge. Whereas in emerging markets, my colleague Paul Beyondich, who runs an open source medical record system that's used in many emerging markets, says, you know, we have this amazing opportunity to actually try to standardize the data now before the services and systems get built. And so you see projects like the Open Concept Lab, which is trying to define key medical terms so that all the different medical systems are all referencing the same terms and the same data schemas to make them much, much, much more interoperable. So really, really interesting. So they're trying to take all this healthcare data and push it over to be kind of standardized to make it easier for the processes and the software that built on top of them to become standardized. Okay, this is my first observation, just kind of some thoughts to tease you with. So the second is we've got to be thinking about how we're going to manage the process around the use of data to create insights. I often like to invite Amin-Ra Masharuki, who is the head of data for the city of New York, for a period to come in. And he really talks about this kind of cycle of kind of intelligence or data analytics that you'd have, which is, you know, you have like the messy city, and what you have is like someone like, you know, some a city councilor or a mayor or somebody who says, I have a problem, I want to kind of better understand. So you then have this period where you do like, you collect data and make observations that create some set of data that you're going to use. And that then turns into a data stream that you're going to use to create models to kind of analyze, that creates insights and knowledge that you then feed back to the leadership that then says, oh, we're going to use this now to change a policy or change an action, that creates outcomes that impact the city that you then want to observe all over and create new data so you can create new models to understand the new impacts and then inform new decisions. This is the kind of cycle that you're always going through. And some questions you have to be thinking about is, do you centralize this like in a central authority, or does every single unit in your organization have their own data capacity? Or can they run this cycle themselves? And the answer is distinct depending on your organization. There's no single answer to that. But what this can, like following the cycle, does two things for you. One is you might start to observe some patterns of types of problems. So like Amin talked about, like in New York, they had like kind of like targeting problems versus prioritizing your backlog type problems, anomaly detection, scenario analysis, and estimating your resources. These were like kind of problems they kind of always were getting asked to solve. So they could start to build tools agnostic of subject matter area to solve these types of problems. And so like some of my favorite were, you know, one was people were illegally pouring grease down city drains. And so they wanted to find the restaurants that were doing this. So you have like someone running a deep fryer, and then at the end of the night, they kind of pour it down the drain, and then it clogs up the drain. It doesn't work. Sewage and rainwater can't drain, and it becomes very expensive. So he's got to go in and unplug it. It's a very, very expensive problem. And so that was, in some ways, a targeting problem. It was like, here are the problems. And then what they had to do was figure out who was upstream from where the problems were happening. What were the restaurants that were upstream? And then could they figure out which were the restaurants that were actually causing the problem? And then what they did, an amazing intervention where they didn't punish the restaurants. They actually got the restaurants to sign up to have fuel recyclers come and collect their fuel. So then that becomes a biofuel that's, you know, economically, so environmentally more sensitive, and it's getting reused. And so that was kind of the way they drove that. The same, they wanted to reduce response times for ambulances. And they did this amazing work where they tried to figure out, well, like how can we get ambulances to people's homes faster? And this was a kind of estimating your resource and problem. And so what the great thing is actually they rode along with the ambulance drivers. And so the ambulance drivers were all pre-positioned in certain locations. But the first thing the ambulance drivers, when they go on shift, is they actually leave their position, which is where they're efficiently allocated, and they go buy coffee because they're all on 12-hour shifts. And so the real insight on this project was to figure out how to make the location for the ambulance, like its station, next to 24-hour coffee joints, because then the ambulance was to stay there and they'd stay in the optimal location, so they're always the fastest to deploy. And I think they knocked like 90 seconds off response times, which is very significant. If you're dying of a heart attack, 90 seconds, it means a lot to you. And so here they were they kind of figured out how to use these things to kind of target these very specific problems. So targeting where the problems were, and then like estimating your resources and deploying them effectively. So next is you want to start thinking a little bit about what are these types of models you can be using, and how do you get a team in place, and how do you get them to think about that cycle so you can start influencing the decision makers, the political and the senior people with data. Okay, and then final one I wanted to talk about, because I want to leave lots of time for questions, because I'm sure there's I'd love to learn what problems you're trying to solve and what you're thinking about. But I really can't stress enough this important challenge about how political data is. I think people often think of data as this like objective thing. You know, it's like a data. It's like the data tells us, and therefore it's a truth. And I just don't think that that's the case. So there are reasons why we think that way, and it's because in part because the data is so useful, and often it seems agnostic. This is a chart of Google Maps on how to get from a location in Vancouver, British Columbia, where I'm originally from, down to the seaplane terminal. And you can see this right now, and it's in English, and then now it's in Spanish, and now it's in Chinese. And this is kind of magical. And it's magical on multiple levels. Like you can take a service and translate to multiple languages, but even more importantly, like most people don't realize it, but the data that actually powers this, the data that tells you how public transit works, that's a great example of that unmodeled to divergent to convergent to structured. That was all done by the Portland Transit Authority in Oregon, who said they wanted their transit data in Google. And they had to beg Google, but they eventually, they basically said, let's create a standard. So they created the standard and then convinced more and more cities who have these divergent ways of doing their data to converge on the standard. And so every night, like thousands of transit authorities are posting their transit data, and Google and Microsoft and others are downloading it. And that's how Google knows what the transit schedule is. It's not that Google's smart and knows where the buses are. They're consuming this data directly from the transit authorities, because we've had this standardization of data that's created this now amazing multilingual service, so that when I go to like Korea, I can navigate public transit, even though I don't speak a word of Korean, because I can use English Google Maps. Completely magical. Similarly, you can have like other types of things that have happened. This is quite outdated now, but I still like to use it. Google had this way of estimating when people would get sick. And this Google blue line shows you when Google was predicting, based on Google searches, when people would get sick. 6 weeks before people got sick. And then this is the Canada Health data, which had like queries of doctors telling Health Canada when people actually got sick on a 6-week lag, so after they got sick. And you can see this incredible correlation. And I think people look at this and they go, oh my gosh, the data is going to solve all our problems. We're going for this utopia. And I think what I want to remind people of is we're not in our first data revolution. We're in the middle of, well, second now maybe with AI, we're in the middle of the third data revolution. But the first data revolution was all the way back in the Victorian era, when we first started to collect data. And that led to all sorts of amazing insights that also made people think that we were going towards some utopia. This is, like, I'm in London, it's great. Like, this is actually not very, it's like maybe a mile from where I am right now. But this is a map of people who were dying from cholera. So like this very famous individual went around and knocked on everybody's doors and kind of basically like how many people died of cholera in the last week, and created this big map. Here's like a kind of modern GIS version for the modern GIS nerds. And the red dots here show you where everybody died, and the blue dots are showing you where the wells are. And it's this map here that actually led the City of London authorities to realize that cholera was coming from certain drinking fountains and wells. And so it caused them to first initially actually shut down this well here, and then the number of people dying from cholera collapsed. And that was really, and then it led to the creation of the sewer system. So they also thought They were like, data is going to be amazing. It's going to solve all our problems. So much data was created in this era that we had to invent the field of statistics. Like, so that's the first real data revolution. But I think the important thing is to recognize actually like the data overlords actually are flawed. The ways we collect data are often problematic. They have all sorts of biases embedded into them, intentionally and unintentionally. So like this map of Toronto that's showing you where people are calling the city from, calling the city to make complaints about problems, you would look at this and be like, oh, there must be a lot of problems in these neighborhoods here. Guess what? Newsflash, these are the wealthiest neighborhoods where people feel the most empowered to call their city and complain. This is actually the downtown core that's all gray here. Nobody calls because nobody lives here, but doesn't mean there's lots of problems. And this is some of the poorer neighborhoods up here. People don't call because they don't think the city cares. So you have huge amounts of biases embedded in these data. So you got to be really careful. You can look at this and be like, oh, we should redeploy our resources to where the most calls are coming in, but you actually might be reinforcing all sorts of inequity. So when I teach, I often like to break my students into group and actually have them think about like, what are all of the problems in this life cycle around bias that could emerge like at the collection phase, at the modeling phase, the analysis phase, and the decision-making phase. So like at the collection phase, like what's getting collected, who decides what's collected, how does it get classified and organized, has huge downstream implications. Likewise, at the modeling phase, like what assumptions are being made in that model and what are the trade-offs you're making versus speed versus accuracy have downstream implications on the decision making. And then what issues get prioritized and like, who the decision makers are then shapes the analysis. And so at every stage here, like and then who gets to see it and who gets to decide, right? At every stage here, you have to be thinking about this really, really carefully. And just to really hammer this home to kind of close this out, I always love to show, like, the Europeans always get blown away by this. I always like to show them like, what do you think this is? Like, what do you think this thing is? And what you're looking at right now is a congressional district. So this is like a congressional district in Chicago that was created. And the only way you can create this congressional district is if you actually have a bunch of data. So the goal of this district was to help ensure that a Latino was getting elected to Congress. So what they did is they said, okay, like, cool, let's link together the Mexican American population with the Dominican population, and we'll like tie it together by this tiny little thread. And that will really help ensure that there's more Hispanic representation in Congress. And so the only way you do this though is if you have census data where kind of like ethnicity, background, age, like quantity of people living. So this data is not neutral. It allows us to kind of make different types of decisions. Okay, let me pause there because I think I've gone now for about 30 to 35 minutes, and I think we only have 25, and I'd love to open the floor for questions. I have more I can share if nobody has anything to ask, but my assumption, or my hope at least, is there might be a few thoughts or comments, and I'd love to dive into those.
Yes, David, you're lucky because there are actually a few questions. So Christoph, if you can share the screen. Some of them are about also the added value of your program in comparison to some other programs, but I'll let you decide which one you want to go for once Christoph shared the screen.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this presentation in the meantime.
Yes, thank you so much, David. That was an amazing presentation. Very good example for like a rich and full, information loaded presentation. I'm sharing here right now the questions that have already been stated in the Slido, but I want to encourage also all participants to raise their hands. And please, if you want to speak out, we can make you a panelist and then open your mic. So yeah, please.
Do you want me to just hit? Okay, so I really want to tackle this first one about Estonia because I hear this a lot, and I find it, Estonia had many advantages. It's not just that they're small; it's that the Russians left and took everything, and so there was not as many business processes and things that were like there was less existing things that you had to kind of rethink and redo. You could kind of build from scratch. You had more greenfield. At the same time, I use Estonia because it's European, but the Brazilians are doing amazing work in this space. That's a country of 200 million, 230 million. The Indians are doing amazing stuff in this space. They have a digital ID. They have a universal payments program. They have a data exchange. I ask my if I'm giving a lecture, I have Indian students in the room, I can ask almost to the one, I can ask them to stand up, open up their phone, and they can open up DigiLocker, which is an app that's been created, and they can pull up, if they're a medical license, if they're a doctor, the deed to their lands in many places, their graduate or undergraduate certificates, even sometimes their high school certificates, their driver's license. They can pull it all up on their phone and share it right away. That's a country of 1.3 billion people. So I don't think size is necessarily a constraint here. I think it's a lot more about will and a sense of capacity and having the right types of capacities. I think there's a huge amount to learn from Estonia despite their size. Also, just say like the X-Road, the underlying X-Road of Estonia has been deployed in at least, I know of 20 countries, and I know there's a whole bunch more that are kind of not public. And those include countries as big as Malaysia. Malaysia's had a digital ID for like almost 20 years now. And they just implemented the X-Road as well. So like, I don't really buy this kind of like this story now that Estonia is kind of unique. It's not been borne out by other countries. So good question, but I feel like this needs to be tackled. Yeah, so I think the Europeans are making interesting choices about GDPR, and are like that is a choice that the Europeans are making. I think that I'm much more interested in like what's the governance of this system look like that makes sense. I think candidly, I think the Europeans are making terrible choices. All I do every day is think about all of the collective hours being lost by people clicking on cookie settings and all the carbon that's created by all the computational power that has to do that for what I can so far tell is basically zero public benefit, but it's huge public cost. I would say too, there's a lot of countries where the development goals far outstrip other types of considerations. So they're not interested in GDPR because they're like, no, we actually, if we want to offer services at scale, we need to be able to do this. And they're kind of thinking about what alternative governance models look like. So yes, the Europeans are going to have to figure out how to do this. But my point is, I don't think you're getting out of the 21st century without a digital ID, without a payments platform that's digital, and without some way of sharing data. And the only question in front of us now is that going to be privately controlled or publicly controlled? Or you're going to really struggle to be competitive with markets that are doing that. And so that's my challenge to the Europeans is how are you going to figure that out? And I don't know that people are going to follow the GDPR model, certainly in emerging markets.
Yeah, thank you for responding to that. They just came in a couple new ones. I'm going to look if we forgot anything down here. Let's see. From there's a great presentation, David. Yeah, how can our public service benefit from your program?
So maybe like there's two pieces there. So if our program is, there's actually a fair amount of material that you could almost treat like a MOOC that you could actually just do on yourself. Like if you go deep enough down, both Enos and I have a pretty documented version of our course, and mine even includes videos of me teaching it. So you can actually go through and you can effectively take the course yourself if you want. We are currently optimizing more to try to help people teach the course, both in civil service colleges, inside government, and inside universities, for several reasons. One is I really want material to be kind of contextually relevant. So I want, someone in Ethiopia getting Ethiopian cases, and I want someone in Indonesia getting Indonesian examples of the work that's going on. Maybe some international as well, but really allowing the faculty to kind of tailor it to those needs. So we've been less focused on like directly teaching it to people because I want to create I think I and my co-founders want to create a global community of people who are teaching. But that doesn't mean there aren't great exec ed programs, and you can always reach out to me. I'm happy to try to find an exec ed program that you could do to take it. But if your government is interested, I'd love to talk to them about helping them skill up people so they can teach their own public servants at scale.
Nice. There's another one down below where it asks, what is in comparison to other programs, what is maybe a distinguishing element of yours?
So I think say our program. So great question. Our program is really focused on trying to provision the minimum viable skills that you need. So I think one of the challenges I'm seeing actually a lot at the moment is at the university level, like you'll often see public affairs schools will have like, they'll go really deep on one thing. So they'll be like, we're going to go deep on cyber, or we're going to go deep on design, or we're going to go deep on digital procurement. And I think it's wonderful. Like, we need people to go deep in all of those areas. But actually what we really need for public administrators is to figure out that you don't have time to go deep on everything. So like when you come take a master's of public policy or master's of public administration degree, you typically, like, what are like required courses, right? So you usually have to take some statistics, you have to take some economics, often some ethics, maybe some public management, maybe. That's like, sadly, that one is like often like a little bit of a maybe. And when you teach each of those, when you get those things, you don't leave the program as an economist, you don't leave the program as a statistician, and you don't leave the program as an ethicist. What you really are learning is like the minimum viable skills for each one of those things, so that you can identify when something's not right. That's often what's going on, because the expectation is you're going to be an analyst or an administrator, and you won't be necessarily going and doing deep work in any given area. You have to know, like, is this okay, and what the problem is. And then you also probably have to have enough knowledge to identify someone who truly is a good economist or is truly a good statistician. And so that's what they're teaching. And I'm really interested in, and so what our course is focused on is, what's the minimum viable knowledge about technology that you need to have in order to do that? So our course is not going to give you a deep dive on like agile methodologies and how to run a Scrum team, and like, it's not going to do a deep dive on like how to become a data scientist. It's not going to do a deep dive on like how to become a designer. Each one of those things is at minimum a course, and is really a degree in its own right. And so the question more for us is, what's the minimum of those? That may mean that you actually do want to do a deep dive in one or two of those, if that's particularly salient for the type of work that you do inside a government. And then we would provide you with a kind of good introduction and a survey of the land, but then you'd want to go find somewhere to go deeper. I hope that's helpful.
There's a question that is kind of related to what you're talking about right now, which is asking you if you actually have a community of policymakers who have gone through your course, as apparently someone in the question is designing one for Israel.
So I have a community of policymakers who've been through my course. So actually, I maintain a mailing list of everyone who's ever touched my course, not on the executive education side, on the degree program side. And but our goal, again, like the community we're really creating is a community of teachers and faculty to help them, but we don't know who they're teaching, and we don't have contact with their students in turn. So we're not kind of creating that type of community. That's its own interesting idea, but it's kind of beyond the scope and the resources we have at the moment.
There's one about the digital ID. You mentioned it, and the person is asking, what are the basic 5 components to start a digital government?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 things going on here. One is, there's actually, like, I think there's like, what are the core digital components to a modern, like, to a digital society? And then there's kind of like, what does the government, like, the government could play a role in those, and then there's what does government need in its own right? And there's some overlap between those two of us. So let me just back out, and I might try to actually find a link as well. So one thing to kind of say is, like, my sense is, yeah, here, sorry for the brief stuttering here. I'm just going to put this in the chat. So here's a piece that I wrote, because there's a lot of conversation, particularly in the G20 now, about what's called being framed as digital public infrastructure. So what is the digital infrastructure you need to run a society? And then should that have a public element to it where we actually want government influence? So for example, like, electrical grids may be privately provisioned, or your electricity might be privately provisioned, but we still think of the kind of electrical utilities as a public infrastructure. And the reason we do is because often the government is both providing funding and regulatory regimes. And in fact, often the kind of trade-off is governments provide basically a guaranteed purchasing amount for the electricity. So your electricity company won't become super wealthy, but it will have a very nice, predictable rate of return. And in exchange for that, we actually remove market forces. So we say things like, yeah, like if someone fails to pay their bill 1 month, you don't just cut them off. Because if you don't have electricity, like it's much harder for you to get a job, social services come take your kids away. So we actually, we prioritize access and inclusion in exchange for government involvement and stability. And so that turns like something that's actually like kind of could be considered a private infrastructure into public infrastructure. And so I think the question is what does that look like in the digital space now? And I kind of shared earlier, like, I don't think you're getting out of the 21st century without some form of digital ID where you can authenticate yourself online and get provision services online, some form of payment system that works online, and some sort of way of data exchange to be able to share your information in ideally in a permissioned way, at least within government, but possibly wider than that. And the current model, like, I kind of like, as maybe problematically, people think I'm American, but I'm Canadian. Maybe problematically, people feel like I was picking on the Europeans on this call. The Americans don't have this figured out. Like the American answer has been like, well, the private sector kind of is dealing with that. And I don't think for the most of the world, that's particularly attractive either. I don't think people want to have their digital identity managed by Google, or they at least are going to want some choice. So the question we have in front of us is, those three things I think are the kind of core that we have to start thinking about at a society scale. And then the question is, do we want it privately provisioned? Do we want it publicly provisioned? Or do we need some new model that's going to do this in a different way? And so, and the answer will be different in different countries. My sense is many say, well, ultimately ID will become publicly provisioned, I think in many countries. But payments in some places like MasterCard and Visa will work. But in a lot of countries, they're like, we don't want to pay the 2.5% tax, like the rents that they extract. And they don't prioritize inclusion and access. And we have a lot of poor people who we want to bring into the economy and power into becoming middle class. So we're going to do that ourselves. And that's what you're seeing happening in Brazil and India. So I think there's going to be a divergent models around that. But those I think are kind of like the core for society. But let me pause there because I don't want my answer to become too long and rambly.
The next question is, could you tell more about X-Road technology? Is that something that you have some insights on?
So, I mean, I will agree with the previous comment that the Estonians, they do love, they do their marketing well. And so like, a trip to Estonia, I'm sure, and the e-governance academy, and I'm sure they will be very happy to tell you about it. But the main thing to think about what the X-Road is it's really a highly secure way of connecting core pieces of data that the government is collecting, so that they only really need to be collected once, but can be leveraged and used across multiple ministries. And so here, like, this is what enables them to have their tell us once policy, which basically if you tell them something, they then store that, and then every form that you encounter gets pre-populated with that data, because they can just query the kind of set of databases across the Estonian government to pull all the data together about you, and then you can correct if it's wrong, and then it gets fixed. So you kind of think of X-Road as really the glue that's binding together all of these different data sources. And there's more to it than that, and I could pull up more slides. But the kind of two key things, one is creating a common language to allow the data to move across that system, and then a highly secure and permissioned way to make sure that only valid people have access to it. So those are that's the core elements of the X-Road.
Thank you for that response as well. There's one question about, it says that we observe many open solutions in e-government. Does that mean mainstream digital providers are not interested in the sector?
I don't think it's that they're not interested in the sector. So it's interesting you see there are many open solutions. I love that statement. You have more confidence than I have about the number of open solutions in eGov. I feel actually there's the amount of vendor lock-in and proprietary solutions is very, 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 very high. And so much more than the open. So it might be great you pop another question on why. I'd love to hear about your optimism on this, because you might know things that I don't know, which would be really, really great. But I do think there's an increasing interest in that, but the amount of vendor lock-in is still very, very, very high. I do think that mainstream digital providers are not interested. That the government has effectively divorced itself from the rest of the market. It used to be that the government was the main consumer of digital technologies, 60 years ago, 70 years ago. And they could kind of set the tone, and everybody kind of followed what they did. And like that started to change like 40 years ago, and now government, right, makes up a fairly small percentage of the space. And it's a very and government's a very, like, as someone who had a company that served government's really hard to deal with. Really, really hard to deal with. And so like candidly, companies will focus on basically business or consumer, or they'll focus on government for the most part. There's some that transcend. And the reason is because the way you sell into government is very different than the way you sell into the rest of the world. And that the cost of selling into government is both a specialized skill and a longer timeline. And so much more difficult and therefore capital intensive. So you have to price differently, because you have to, if you're only successful 1 or 3 times that you try to do it, and it takes 9 months for them to buy, that's very different than the private sector where it happens in weeks and it gets all over. So you have to pay for that sales cycle and for that high failure rate. And that means, like, one of the reasons why governments end up with a lot of companies whose tech is second rate or is not all that great is because the defining skill that makes you successful when selling to government is to be in the government space is not the quality of the technology, it's your ability to navigate procurement.
In one question, one of the attendees is questioning the tangibility of concrete use cases when it comes to a data-driven public sector. What is your opinion on that? That's
not sure I understand the question. What they have? So do you say they have skepticism about data?
It says that data-driven public sector is a popular term, but then if you look at the literature, the number of tangible and concrete use cases is very limited.
So I love the question. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was trying to get to at the last part of that is that, like, you can't, I actually have more slides I could have got onto, which is basically like, you can't, like, I have a set of slides where I'm basically like, you know, I think of politics like energy. You can't destroy energy, right? Like, it's just, energy just moves from one place to another, right? And so politics is the same. So if you try to depoliticize the process, I don't think you actually remove the politics. You just shift shift the political activity to an adjacent space. So if you say, oh, we're going to make this decision like a data-driven decision, the risk is actually you now shift the politics to the data that's getting collected. That becomes, you're like, oh, if I can't influence here, I can influence the data that gets collected, and that will shape the decision. So then the data collection becomes very, very political. And then if I can't influence there, then I'm like, I'm going to go over like on the distribution side, and I'm going to make that very political. I'm basically going to say, like, I'm going to like say everybody who collected data is biased, the analytics is biased. I'm going to, you know, I'll make that a very political play. So we have to be very careful in the pretending. My point in this lecture, in that part of the lecture, was to say, like, you can't remove the politics. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have good processes, and we shouldn't try to have processes that are fair, but we have to recognize the inherent politics in these systems. And that should also be like constantly question us, like, you know, are we being biased in ways that we don't and we don't know? That said, I do think that there are a number of like compelling examples where data is being used to make systems more effective and more efficient. So I'm not sure I agree with the statement. I think there's very few examples. Like, I think off the top, like I showed 2 there, like the example of the finding the people pouring grease and the finding people and like improving ambulance arrival times by 90 seconds. Those were like what's amazing to me is like those are 2 examples that are at the local level. They're pretty niche, like not big national government strategy. So you can see this stuff's happening. It's happening at the local level, and there's things that are happening at the national level. So, but I do think that there's a lack of capacity and a lack of skill that makes it harder for it to happen. And I'd love to see that get solved.
Yeah, thank you for that response. I think yeah, the examples are pretty tangible actually. So there's now looking at the time, we still have time. I also want to encourage again, if someone wants to raise their voice, please indicate it, and then we will open the mic.
Well, there is this great question here about like not all countries plus publishers like, you know, have strong data ecosystems and data skills. So I really like a lot of empathy for this, and this is like one of the reasons why, you know, we're so interested in having our course translated. So some of these inequities can't be solved easily, right? Like there is just a question of like taking time to collect, like on the collection side, like how do you even get enough data to have a data ecosystem like that? There's a resource challenge there that I don't have, like, there's no like straightforward answers to. I think the more encouraging thing is on the skill side, there, like, we could do a whole lot more. Like I've always been a fan of like the team at Kaggle. That's like a data competition website, and just like the fact that they have like these like constantly running competitions where you can go and learn, and like there are great free MOOCs for learning R and learning Python. Like there's just no shortage of ways to skill people up. If you like, you know, those things presume literacy, access to computers. Like I'm not trying to pretend like there aren't all sorts of other barriers, but there's so much that we could be doing in this space. On the skill side, at least. And I think the more skilled people, the more people you have skills, the more they'll demand more data. And that might be the way to go, as opposed to trying to create data in the abstract. But maybe the bigger thing I'd say is really focusing on real problems. If you can get politicians, if you can tell politicians that we can help you solve tangible problems that will make your societies better and get you reelected, they're very keen to create data and very keen to create data analytics skills if they see the connections to those things. And so one thing I worry about is that sometimes people just be like, they try to think of data, they try to think of this domain as kind of like an agnostic domain where we're just going to create capacity. And that might work in some countries. But in countries where resources are scarce, you do have to connect yourself to the political needs. That's how you connect yourself to an agenda where there's resources.
I think we're going to be able.
It's a great example, David. You just mentioned before Estonia, and then I'm following the sort of Kaggle challenges they are publishing on their website. I think it's a great example. Maybe we can learn from. They are identifying problems. They also provide the data set, but not just to solve the, let's say, general challenges, but that are helping the public sector in improving their decision making. So that's another good example from that country.
And it's one of the reasons I get so excited. Like, I think open data has had some wins and has not fulfilled all its potential. But I have an old blog post I wrote about like thinking of open data portals as like libraries. So when we first built libraries, we didn't build the libraries after everybody knew how to read. We built libraries when no one knew how to read, because we needed to have content and a place to teach people. Like the libraries were kind of schools, and they were also like the place where you go learn content to go learn. And the key thing about libraries was we were pretty good about not censoring the books that went into them. So it was really like, how do we get books that workers care about, that farmers care about, that like, all these people we wanted to learn how to read? How do we fill the libraries up with books that they want to read? And so for me, like I think of open data portals as modern day libraries. It's at least a place where if you can give people some basic skills, they can go get data about their community that they can go play with, and maybe they'll have an insight or maybe they won't, but it gives them something that is closer to them that they may be more likely to care about to go learn on.
Yeah, definitely. Just this morning we delivered another webinar together with the colleagues from the publication office. They are in charge of this great open portal that is data.euro.eu. You can also easily find a lot of resources. They are proposing also a series of use cases where public administration are trying to reuse the open data to maybe create apps or new service for citizens. So I will share the link also in the chat. So thanks a lot, David, for your really insightful presentation, and also for the answer you shared with us. It has been really a big pleasure for me. Thanks also to my colleagues again, and we invite you to subscribe for the next iTalk that is going to be this Monday, with Barbara Ubaldi from the OECD. Thanks.
And I just want to say thank you for having me, and thank you for like really great questions. Really enjoyed these questions, and even the ones where I push back, like send me an email. Like that, yes. The process of learning is that debate. And so for those who send questions that didn't get answered, feel free to try to reach out. And for those that I push back on, come back at me and let me know what you're thinking. I love these conversations. That's how I learn. So grateful for the great questions.
Great. Also say thanks to Ines that I know very well, because what you're doing, also the fact you are translating the content in different languages is key. Thanks again, and have a nice rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye to all
Bye-bye.
attendees. Bye-bye. Ciao. Thanks.
David, if you want maybe to share your contact in the chat, feel free.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea. Perfect. Thank you. Okay.